Is this reference too old and nobody actually gets it? Yeah. Oh, okay. All right. All right. All right. It's old. I'm an old person. It's Jay-Z song, if that helps you. All right. So we're talking about ecology, our final unit. Kind of it's broken up into two sections. First is like the science of ecology, and the second part is about human impacts on the earth. So that's sort of the two sections of this unit. There's two different note packets. And like I said, a lot of this is probably a review for you. You probably studied this, and I know you did in seventh grade, life science. Also, probably at some point in elementary school, you talked about ecosystems and food webs and herbivores and carnivores and that sort of stuff. So that's also part of this unit. So when we talk about ecology, ecology is a science. It's what I studied in college, actually. It was ecology. There's a course here. Mr. McNair teaches a course in ecology that you could take probably when you're a senior. Ecology is studying organisms, living things, and how they interact with their environment, with their surroundings as well. So, biology is a study of living things, and geology is a study of the earth. And if you kind of put some of those things together, you start to come to ecology, which is how do those things interact with each other? So when we think about the earth, when we think about ecology, we can go from the biggest picture of all, which we call the Earth's biosphere. That's basically all of the earth where you have living life, which is basically the whole surface of the earth. Even in areas, the desert, there's life in the desert. Even in the oceans, the open ocean, it's teeming with life. So all of the parts of the earth where you have living things, we call that the biosphere. And then if we start to shrink things down a little bit, on the earth, we have individual biomes. For example, the tundra is a biome. The desert is a biome. The savanna, the temperate deciduous forest, the tropical rainforest, all of those are called biomes. And they're ecosystems that have certain characteristics. They're formed because of climate in different parts of the earth is why we have these different biomes in different areas. If we continue to shrink sort of smaller, we could start to talk about an ecosystem. An ecosystem is sort of a group of organisms and, oh, you don't have any of this filled in? A group of organisms, okay, and their physical environment, the area around them. And ecosystems can be big.
Could you say that again?
No, I can't. No, I can't.
Hear what you said.
Well, you better listen better next time. Sorry. I have no patience for her. So an ecosystem can be small, a little forested area around your house, maybe, a pond, or it could be really large. It could be, a giant lake. Lake Michigan is an ecosystem. And it has living things, non-living things. They influence each other. They interact with each other. The ecosystem is both living and non-living together. If we go smaller, we can look in that ecosystem and see only the living organisms, the collection of species that are in an area. We call that the community. And then if we get to our smallest level, we have individual populations. And I'll post a hard copy of this online. I know there's a lot to write down there, but I will post a hard copy online as well. A population is one single species. So all the white-tailed deer living in the woods around your house, that's one single population. It's a single species. All of the lake trout in First Lake in the Adirondacks, that's a population. It has to be a single species to be considered a population. So that's kind of how we organize things. as we think about ecology, from the larger scale, the biosphere, down to populations. When we think about nature, when we think about ecosystems, if you think about the forest around here, can they can that forest support an unlimited number of white-tailed deer? What do you think? Could a pond support a limitless number of bass? No. There's limits to how many individuals can be supported in a given ecosystem. Okay? That's because there's limited resources. In that pond, there's only a certain amount of food available to a certain number of bass. Okay, and what happens if the bass population goes above what the pond can support? Yeah, there'll be a die-off, that they can't all survive. There's not enough food to support all of them. It's not just food, it could be oxygen, right? There could only be a limited amount of oxygen, or there's a limited amount of sun to support plants, things like that. So we call those things that are limiting the size of a population the limiting factors, the resources. And sometimes they're living things, sometimes they're non-living things. For example, if it's a non-living thing like the amount of rainfall. For example, in the desert, there's not a lot of plants because rainfall, precipitation, water is a limiting factor. There's only a small amount of water, and so it can only support a small number of plants. Other ecosystems, like the tropical rainforest, has a ton of precipitation. That's not a limiting factor in the tropical rainforest. It just depends on the location. Other times it could be predators that limit the population size. So the living factors are called biotic factors. Bio means life. Non-living factors are called abiotic factors. And so the term we have for the overall size the population can be is called its carrying capacity. Here's an example. This is a very famous experiment where scientists tracked the number of deer on an island. And over a period of time, I think the story was this was like a military base, Walla Walla Island, and the military kind of left and kind of abandoned it, but scientists stayed and tracked the population of white-tailed deer. What they found is that over time, at first several years, the population of deer increased dramatically. And you can see that over time, the number of deer skyrocketed. But then it kind of peaked and leveled off and came back down and then stayed relatively stable. So how many deer, what do you think, how many deer could this island support based on this data? Could it support 98 deer?
Around 80 deer?
Yeah, right around 80, right? Because that after when the population did go up close to 100, there was, like what John said earlier, there was a die-off. For some reason, maybe it's the amount of food, then couldn't support 100 deer. And so the population declined. And then it leveled off right around 80. We would call that number the carrying capacity of this ecosystem. Okay? That the number of organisms that can be supported is its carrying capacity. I got to switch this presentation. Hold on. So if we think about an ecosystem, think about a forest around here, there are a whole bunch of different types of living organisms, right? You might have deer, you might have squirrels, you have mushrooms and bacteria and worms and trees and plants. A wide variety of different types of living things. And the word we use for sort of the different role that an organism plays in an ecosystem, we call it its niche. Okay? And a niche includes the role the species plays. It includes what does it eat? When is it active? Where exactly in the ecosystem does it live? All of those factors about a species, we call its niche. So if we had two different animals and they both live in the same area, they both eat the same foods, they both eat at the same time, what's going to happen with those two different species? They have the same needs and same requirements, and there's a limited amount of resources. Yeah, but you're on the right track. We have a word for that.
Like fight for priority.
Yeah, there's a term for that. Competition. The two species might compete with each other for whatever limited resources that there might be. When species have the same niche, when they want the same thing at the same time in the same place, then there's competition. And what we see sometimes is one species is better adapted to that situation and it is going to win out, and the other species may become extinct in that area. Okay? Some animals actually alter their living situation to avoid competition. For example, these warblers all eat basically the same food from the same types of trees. In order to avoid competition, one type of warbler eats on the lower sections of the trees, then another type of warbler eats in the middle areas, and another eats at the top area. And so they've sort of, even though they eat the same foods, they've changed each of their niches so they can avoid direct competition. And then this ecosystem can support all three of those species. So when we think about an ecosystem, we think about resources, we have to think about energy. What's the source of energy for all life on Earth, basically? The sun. We could really trace back all energy that living things need back to the sun in some way. What do we call the organisms that could use the sun's energy to make their own food? The process is photosynthesis. Organisms that can go through the process of photosynthesis have two different names: producers or autotrophs. They all mean the same thing. Autotrophs take in the sun's energy, as we learned earlier in the year, and use it to produce their own food, to produce glucose. Mostly it's plants, but there's some other things that can also make their own food. They're also producers: algae, phytoplankton, a couple other things. Other organisms, how do we get energy then? We can't go through photosynthesis. So how do we get energy?
If we eat plants, we get their energy, and if we eat an animal that eats plants, we get their energy.
Exactly. We get energy. We are consumers, also called heterotrophs. In order to get energy, we need to consume other organisms. Sometimes it's plants, like I consume plants. Most of you consume plants and animals. But either way, you could trace that energy back to the sun. Say you had some bacon for breakfast this morning. Where'd that bacon come from? A pig? Where'd a pig get its energy? Probably grain. And what is grain? It's like a plant. And where did it get its energy? The sun. So you could trace back, think about anything that you eat. Originally, the energy came from the sun. Well, how about if you drink an energy drink that has sugar in it? Did that come from the sun? What is sugar? It's glucose. It comes from a plant. It comes from sugar cane, a plant that grows using the sun's energy. So autotrophs can go through photosynthesis. They don't need to eat anything. They make their own food. Heterotrophs have to eat things to get energy. And we have different groups of heterotrophs. Probably familiar with these words, right? An herbivore eats only plants. Carnivores eat only other animals. Omnivores eat both. You mostly are omnivores. There's also decomposers. Decomposers actually break down dead organisms, and that's what they consume for energy. And in the process, they recycle their nutrients, returning them back to the soil. So, to show these relationships between organisms, we use food webs and food chains. They're just diagrams that show us the flow of energy in an ecosystem. A food chain is simple, it's simplified. It shows one organism eats another, which eats another. Here's an example: a maple tree is eaten by a beetle, which is eaten by a frog, which is eaten by a snake. Sometimes people get confused on the arrow direction. The arrow always go from what was eaten to what ate it. The arrows represent the flow of energy. So the maple tree absorbs energy from the sun, and that energy goes to the beetle, then from the beetle to the frog, from the frog to a snake. Here's another example: this dandelion to a snail, to a sparrow, to a hawk. Or algae to mosquito larva, to dragonfly larva, to a bass, to a pike, to a person. Those are all food chains because they're one direct line from one organism to another. We label the different levels in a food chain. We call them trophic levels. A trophic level is each step of a food chain. So, like the dandelion is the first trophic level, and then the snail is the second level, and the third level, and the fourth level. A food web is more complex. A food web shows several food chains interconnected. Most organisms don't just eat one prey, right? These are not really realistic, these food chains, if you really want to understand an ecosystem. Because a frog doesn't only eat beetles, it probably eats a variety of insects. A snake doesn't just eat frogs, it eats a variety of animals. And so a food web like this gives us a more accurate picture of how energy is flowing through an ecosystem. So we have on the bottom typically are producers. We know that they're producers because they have no arrows pointing to them. There's no arrow pointing to this vegetation. That's because they don't eat anything. It's because they go through the process of photosynthesis. They use the sun's energy to make food. Everything else has arrows to it because everything else has to eat something. So this food web shows us these benthic invertebrates eat the phytoplankton, and then these invertebrates are eaten by the sea ducks, which are eaten by the bald eagle. And so you could pick out of this food web several different food chains. And also, we sometimes label these food chains and food webs, and we label the consumers. The first level consumers are the herbivores. They are the things that eat the plants. The things that eat those herbivores are called second level consumers, and so on, third level, fourth level. Usually in ecosystems, we don't go much beyond 4 or 5 levels because we run out of energy eventually. So often what we see in an ecosystem is a relationship between predator and prey. Now, do predators control the population size of their prey? Or do the amount of prey determine how many predators there are? They both seem to make sense, right? And it's a combination. What we often see in an ecosystem in a predator-prey situation is that they limit each other. If you look at this graph, this is a very famous example of predator-prey relationships. It's the hare and the lynx. Okay, this was done a long time ago. It's a famous example. It's from the 1930s. But what you see, the hare, which is like a rabbit, is the solid line. What we see is as the hare population rises, if you look at the dotted line, which is a lynx, it's a predator, after the hare population reaches a peak, then the lynx population goes up. But as the lynx population goes up, they consume more of the hares. The hare population then goes down. And since there's fewer hare, there's fewer lynx that can be supported. So that population goes down. Then there's fewer lynx, so the hare population can increase. So we have this kind of cyclical up and down population where the predator and prey are rising and falling in relationship to each other. Call that a predator-prey cycle. I guess let's pause there for now. Okay, we'll talk more about energy next class.